Welcome to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Once more, my guest is Dr. Steve Miller from Kennesaw State University and the author of several books. We're going to talk about one today in particular called Faith That's Not Blind. I asked Dr. Miller to have this conversation with me. Thank you for holding up your copy. I think I packed my copy already. Yeah, we were talking before the show started about the change of my bookshelves as part of the transition process as we're doing this move here in the near future. But when I read Dr. Miller's book, I was struck by that, another book that we're going to talk about in the next episode. If I had read both of those books before I wrote the God Conclusion, I told Dr. Miller before we started that I don't think I would have felt the need to write the God Conclusion because your books put together, both of them cover the same material and then some. I think you go above and beyond what I provided in terms of evidence for God. You had 20 different bullet items that had data supporting it, or it wasn't just a numeric list of, but it was 20 different subjects that you cited that were considered evidence for God. The first of them was NDEs, which is a subject near and dear to my heart. And I'm sorry, go ahead and jump in anytime because I haven't
Well,
really prepared the questions as well as I normally do.
let me say, first of all, I think your comment that you wouldn't have written the book had you read mine first, I think that's a very humble comment and very nice and flattering. But I would say I really appreciated your book when I read it. And yes, it seems like a lot of the same evidence gravitates toward both of us as to what we feel like is compelling. And so we're covering a lot of the same topics, but you need lots of different books taking it from each person's own individual research. So I didn't feel like in reading your book at all that it was like redundant concerning mine. I thought it was well written, came up with new angles that I was glad to see. And I think we're just trying to putting it our own way. And so this book, to show you what I'm trying to do with it, with your book, you were putting together the evidence in the way that you saw it that was compelling to you personally and you felt would be compelling to others. I was thinking particularly of my students since I teach an introduction to religion class. In it, I have them read atheists like David Hume or others that are arguing against the Christian faith, Bertrand Russell. And then I'll have critiques of those written from a theistic perspective. So I have a lot of back and forth in the first half of the course, which is on philosophy of religion. The second half is more on the large world religions, actually studying them. But in that first section, I thought it seems to me in so many philosophy and religion classes, they'll cover a couple of traditional arguments for the existence of God, like the teleological argument and the cosmological argument, ontological argument, and these. And then they'll go back and forth on them, and as if that's the only evidence that there is. And I thought, wow, I don't think that some of those are necessarily the main things that believers are thinking about when they think about evidence for God. Some of them are, but there's a much wider range of compelling evidence, at least it's compelling to believers that have led them to the faith. So I thought, let's put together something, not a big book trying to put together all the evidence, but just a small book, which came out to what, 100 or so pages, 115 pages if you include the end notes, and just give a few pages to each line of argument. So I came up with about 17 basic lines of argument where I'm saying, this is something, here's the line of argument where it goes, why a lot of smart people think that this helps compel them to believe in God. And then I would usually give a biographical example of someone who wrote about this, or that line of argument actually was a part of them coming to faith. It's something that I could give my students. They could read it in a week, and then I have them actually rate each argument on a scale of 0 to 10 as to how compelling it is. And so I have everybody from atheists to agnostics to theists to Christians to Mormons, people from India, Hindus, whatever in the class. So it's interesting to see what's compelling to them. So one benefit to for this is, number one, my students get a better idea of why people are religious. Number two, it gives me an opportunity to collect this data and see which arguments are the most compelling to students and why. So this has been a fun little book to have out there and to use with hundreds and hundreds of students. Because I had probably in the fall in this one course, I had probably 145 students. So that's some rich data there. And I teach the class every semester.
Again, to me, it was remarkable. I don't know why I'm acting like I'm so surprised, because there's only so much evidence that's in the world. And of course, we're going to come across the same evidence, but to some degrees. But to me, it was like you had read my mind, and everything that was in my book in the chapter that I called Existential Scientific Evidence about the beginning of the universe, the fine tuning of the universe, the origin of life, all of that information is in this book in a very condensed form that's very easy to read for a beginning college student, like you said. So I think it's a terrific book for the ideal target audience of somebody that's got a semester to read this book and assimilate the information that's in it. But even though it's only 115 pages or so, it's packed with information that I did not know. For example, one of my favorite people in the last century, it was Fred Hoyle. I thought he was just absolutely brilliant man. And I had known the calculation for the fine tuning of the universe. And I'd always been looking for a value to represent the difficulty of abiogenesis. And the best that I had been able to come up with was a quote from a guy named Ilya Prigogine, who was a two-time Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. And he said essentially that abiogenesis was impossible, that the probability of it happening by chance was zero. And I
And
don't like
by abiogenesis, you're
the
meaning the beginning of life. Genesis being beginning, bio being life. So how did these cells get here? That's the question. They're
how did
living
we
cells.
get
They can't get here by evolution, because for evolution to work, you'd have to have already living things. So how do we explain these extremely complex cells happening naturalistically? Am I following you right here?
Absolutely. It's
Mhm.
the question of how did we go from inanimate matter to the very first living organism? And from listening to scientists like James Tour and people of that caliber, modern scientists, they talk about the interdependencies that the cell has on other structures like lipids and enzymes that have to exist prior to the cell coming into existence. So there are these multiple interdependencies that must be satisfied in order for the very first living organism to form.
Right.
But you had come up with a number from Fred Hoyle. It wasn't necessarily the odds of a living organism forming by chance, which was his famous tornado through the junkyard producing a 747 analogy. But you said that it was the odds of a functional protein or an enzyme is 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. And I've been looking into these numbers. To me are silly numbers. Once you get to 1 in 10 to the 300th power or 1 in a million, I don't know how that really translates in relation to 1 in a billion odds or 1 in a million odds. And somewhere I finally came up with, I think, oh, it was your book. It was the odds of 1 in a billion, or that can be expressed as 1 in 10 to the ninth power. And
Right.
the number of all the atoms in our universe combined is only 1 in 10 to the 80th power. So 1 in 10 to the 300th power comes into a new perspective when you are able to put it in relation to other numbers. 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. That's a number to me that it is basically saying it's impossible.
Zilch. Right.
Yeah.
If you say, okay, like I'm going to Vegas and I'm going to do something in a slot machine and the odds are 1 in 5 that I'm going to get something back rather than lose my money. Okay. You say, hey, I'm on vacation. Yeah, the odds are against me, 4 out of 5 chances that I'm going to lose it. But hey, I'm on vacation. I'll try it. And who knows, maybe I'll get something big. So small odds can sometimes pay off great and they're worth the chance. But if it's like 1 in 100 odds, if it's 99% chance that I'm going to that's 1 times 10 to the second power. Okay. If it's that kind of odds that are saying that I'm going to lose my money, 99% chance, why would I do that? That's crazy. One out of, I'm just throwing my money away to get nothing. But then you start taking odds like 1 times 10 to the ninth power, 1 in a billion, and you're now what we're talking about risking here is our lives. It's pretty important. Okay, so if the odds of this coming into this life coming about by purely naturalistic odds, if it's 1 in a billion, I'm thinking, wow, that just couldn't happen. Now, Richard Dawkins comes back, and I believe it's chapter 3 in The God Delusion. Then he says, okay, our problem here is that we're not used to dealing with big numbers. He says, actually, think of it this way. Actually, 1 in a billion. He said, what if the odds of the first life, the first cells coming about naturalistically are 1 in a billion? That's 1 times 10 to the, what did we say, ninth power.
Ninth power. Yeah.
Ninth power. And he said, hey, think about it. There's a billion planets out there. Surely, if all this naturalistic stuff was happening, and our odds were 1 in a billion, then if there are that many planets out there, then the odds are pretty good that in one of these planets, life is going to form, right? And so, hey, since we're the ones here living to talk about it, obviously it happened on our planet. Now, the problem I'm seeing is that I think Dawkins was right and he proved it that we're not very good with dealing with big numbers because he was actually arguing against Fred Hoyle's analogy of saying that the odds of, I forgot exactly the odds of what he was talking about when he said the odds of life coming about by natural causes are about the odds of a hurricane going through a garbage dump and forming a Boeing 747. So Dawkins is arguing against his analogy. Dawkins comes along and says, no, we can explain this with big numbers. But what he did slyly, I think, was to shift the numbers. Because Hoyle, if he went back to Hoyle, he never used Hoyle's numbers, which he figured it out, which was saying it was not 1 in a billion, 1 in 10 to the ninth power. Hoyle figured it as 1 times 10 to the 40,000th power. That's, if I were to put it, I should have just written it on a little blackboard here and put it up. I can write 1 times 10 to the ninth power. That's 1 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0. There it is. But if I were to write 1 times 10 to the 40,000th power, I'd have to write 40,000 zeros out there, and they'd be going all the way out to the street and down the street. That's a totally different number. Like you say, this is way past the number of atoms in the universe. So what he has to do is to shift the numbers. Now you say, where did Hoyle come up with these numbers? And he's not the only one to come up with this, but he's got a book called The Mathematics of Evolution, and he actually goes through, and if you like math, this is the book for you, because he goes down through, and Hoyle was very good at math. He was teaching at Cambridge University, and there's a statue of Fred Hoyle at Cambridge University. This guy, if they put a statue to me at Kennesaw State, I'll feel like, oh my goodness, I've made it in academics. He's at Cambridge University at the time, and he was brilliant at math, an astrophysicist. He took the time to go through and calculate the odds and came out with this one. He says, what, even to get a functional protein or an enzyme, just a part of the cell, much less the whole cell, if that's 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power, that's just basically saying it ain't gonna happen. You're gonna have some guiding force. And he was not a Christian trying to prove Christianity, or a theist trying to prove theism, the existence of God. He had become an atheist, I think, shortly after high school or around that time, had been an atheist his entire life. And he came in kicking and screaming at the end of this. Someone else had challenged him. I think it was saying that you've challenged him to figure these odds. After he did it, he came in kicking and screaming. He said, it's got to be intelligence. There's got to be intelligence. Somebody had to insert this information in there and make it happen. The odds are just astronomical.
Absolutely.
So I try to say that in 3 pages there, I think, in my book. But then I'll say, okay, here's some odds. Here's what Dawkins said. Here's my reply to Dawkins that you switch numbers on us. And then I'll say, hey, if you want to read more, read this and this.
I would argue that Dawkins doesn't really care what the number is. I think we would both agree he's not the best at math to begin with. But Dawkins, his argument ultimately is that no matter how improbable the numbers that underlie the Big Bang and cosmic inflation and abiogenesis are, the creator God is even more improbable. No matter what, if it's 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power is the worst number that you've got on the side for the unplanned universe, the argument for the planned universe, according to Dawkins, is got to be worse than 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. I don't really necessarily understand the logic of that. And again, like you said, if you went to Las Vegas and you were told you had a 1% chance of winning, you wouldn't play. You wouldn't gamble. 1 in a million. I remember the movie Star Wars. Remember at the very end when Luke's flying his X-Wing fighter to the Death Star and he takes the shot without the targeting camera, and the shot actually goes and bends at a 90-degree angle. It goes down to the reactor and blows everything up. And immediately after, Han Solo says, "Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million." I would argue it was a lot worse than 1 in a million, and it was Hollywood special effects that were necessary to bend that shot 90 degrees. But even so, it made for a great storyline. But in the real world, those odds just don't work.
No, no. We don't take one out of a million odds with our life or with our with the important beliefs of our life. Now, I personally, if you're thinking in terms of logic and evidence, I'm more scientific on how close you can get to 100% evidence. But since I think that it's always possible that we're in a matrix and we just think that we're having this conversation, or somebody's projecting it and they're fooling with our minds, since that's always got to be an outside possibility, I can never get to 100% on anything. But I can't get 100% on any of the major choices I make in life. But if you're looking at the one chance in 10 to this astronomical power, 40,000, or even 1 in a million, you're saying, okay, this is a good rational reason to make a decision. If this did not happen naturalistically, intelligence has got to be behind it. And what kind of intelligence are we talking about? Number one, massive intelligence. Number two is probably something personal, this intelligence, because there's some reasoning behind it. That makes more sense than saying it's some impersonal reason or an impersonal being. And since you got a beginning of the universe, it seems like it's got to be something that's outside of space and time. Even Richard Dawkins says in that chapter 3, I believe, he says the standard presentation of the Big Bang is that time and space began at the Big Bang. Okay. That doesn't give us enough time. We don't have an infinite amount of time for these things to happen. And that's why Fred Hoyle was able to assign the odds. Now, he said, maybe, hey, maybe we didn't have enough time here on Earth, but maybe we had life developing in another galaxy somewhere, or within our solar system, and it came down in a rock fell from space and came down here and introduced it. He said, yeah, but you're still just pushing it back. There's not enough time for these things to have happened.
That's a brilliant point because the guy who co discovered DNA, Francis Crick,
Hmm.
is the one who calculated the odds of DNA forming on the earth. And what he quickly figured out was there wasn't enough time for DNA to form randomly by random assembly from the time that the earth formed until today, much less to account for how quickly life shows up in the fossil record after the formation of the earth, which, according to the scientists, if you just go by the scientific numbers, the earth is about I think 4.6 billion years old, and life formed on the earth only about 400 million years after that. So if we just take at face value, and that's what I do in the guide conclusion, is I say Roger Penrose and Martin Rees and Fred Hoyle are the experts. So they are the ones who have made these calculations of 1 in 10 to the 300th power, and 1 in a million, and 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. All of those numbers are produced by experts, almost all of them being atheists, but that's them describing the math that applies to the little niche of science that they are studying. So Fred Hoyle was studying the origin of life. They actually studied everything, but that was where he made his contribution, and Roger Penrose made the contribution of the numerics, the statistical analysis of the Big Bang and cosmic inflation. Those calculations were all done by Roger Penrose. And I say, I just take their values at face value and I just plug them into the calculation. And I say the universe is either planned or unplanned. And if it's unplanned, then it's 1 in 10 to the 300th power times 1 in a million million
Mhm.
times 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Because I'm looking to solve for why life exists in this
Why
universe.
are we all here? And why is it
Exactly.
like this?
Exactly. And Francis Crick, getting back to him, he did the calculations and he said there's not enough time for it to have happened on Earth. So he came up with the theory called panspermia. But then I don't know if it was a joke or not, but he put directed in front of it so that it was brought here intelligently to colonize the Earth. And so to me, it's a remarkable thing to see these absolutely brilliant people twist themselves up logically like pretzels to come up with viable alternate explanations to the most obvious one, which is a designed universe has a designer, a created universe has a creator. There has to be intelligence to explain the fact that you and I have some reasonable form of intelligence, that we're at least able to connect our computers and have this conversation. So to me, it's, and another person that you cite in this book, Susan Blackmore. I love reading her stuff because she argues that there is no reason or purpose to our lives, but you should buy my book. There is reason or purpose for her life, which is to sell books, but you don't have any reason for your existence other than to read it.
She, in her book Against Near Death Experiences, where she tries to explain them naturalistically, it goes further than lack of purpose when she's trying to say, why are these near death experiences so real to people? Now, as I got into the chapter, I said, okay, she's just going to say they seem real to people, but that just seeming it's real doesn't mean that it's real. I figured she'd go that direction. Instead, she goes all Buddhist on us and starts saying, actually, what's going on in these things is that your brain, our brains, we really don't have any me or an I that's up in a director's chair telling our brain what to think. It's just a brain making decisions. This whole thing of an I making decisions, that's just, there's no evidence for that. It's not there. So we're just brains going about doing our things, just like a computer going about doing its thing. And so when you have a near death experience, your brain gets all fuzzed up and has to make sense of what's going on. So you get this feeling that I am going to the other side and it's trying to make sense of what's going on in your life. But really, there is no sense to it all. It's just our brain making these decisions. And I thought, okay, so if there is no I that's making use of my brain to make rational decisions, if I have no will of my own to make these decisions, why should I keep reading this book? It's already destined by my brain, by physical, as to what I'm going to think and what I'm going to feel. How do I know that any of my conclusions are true or consistent with reality if my brain's just making everything up as it goes? I think it gets even more complex than that. What can I read just a little bit from Fred Hoyle? I know you love Fred Hoyle. I think he's a
Please
very
do.
interesting character. This is his book, Mathematics of Evolution. If you're really into, you really need to be into some higher math, calculus type stuff in order to understand his reasonings. But you can read between the occasions and get where he's going. Mathematics of Evolution. And then this is another one called Evolution from Space. Let's see if it comes up over here. Here we go.
Yeah, there
Evolution
we go.
from Space. And at the end of it, again, this is a person who's an atheist who's struggling with it. He begins to look deeply into the math of what it would take to form enzymes and cells. And here he comes with his conclusion.
Before you read that, I want to interrupt and argue, push back a little bit because I
Sure.
agree. early in his career, particularly before when he was mocking the Big Bang and didn't believe it was a valid explanation for the existence of the universe, he favored the steady state theory until he saw the evidence with his own eyes and he couldn't refute it. And then that really changed his perspective on things. But by
Right.
the end of his life, I would argue that he was a deist. He probably was never a theist, but I would say that he was probably a deist because there was a quote that I had in my book where he talked about this a super intellect monkeying with the physics and the chemistry to create life, and no other explanation was really worth considering or mentioning.
Yeah,
But
and I think this is precisely where I'm about to read as to where he's telling of coming to that conclusion in his life. And I need to read a biography of him. You've read more on his later years, and I really haven't. But he said, we did not arrive all in a moment at the position described in this book. We had no thought in the beginning that the small track we were then following, which was organic materials and interstellar space, he thought, okay, maybe it's all came from space, developed elsewhere. More time, we need more time, right, for this thing to happen. Only gradually, with the discovery and dovetailing of many facts, did the overall picture at least become evident. But in that dawn of certainty, in what might have been a moment of satisfaction, we hit a difficulty that knocked the stuffing out of us. No matter how large the environment one considers, life cannot have had a random beginning. Troops of monkeys thundering away at random on typewriters could not produce the works of Shakespeare, for the practical reason that the whole observable universe is not large enough to contain the necessary monkey hordes, the necessary typewriters, and certainly the waste paper baskets required for the deposition of wrong attempts. And the same is true for living material. As our ideas developed, a monstrous specter kept beckoning. A specter, a ghost kept. He didn't want to come to this conclusion. This is a monstrous thing. He's an atheist. Everything's naturalistic, right? So this monstrous specter kept beckoning. Just as the brain of Shakespeare was necessary to produce the famous plays, so prior information was necessary to produce a living cell. But information from where? From some pre existent life form, one is tempted to answer. But this would be to incur the ire of Tommy Gold, who tells the following story. A male lecturer had spoken about the nature of the earth and planets. Afterward, an old lady came up to him from the audience claiming she had a theory superior to the one he had described. We don't live on a ball revolving around the sun, she said. We live on a crust of earth on the back of a giant turtle. Wishing to humor the old lady, the lecturer asks, and what does this turtle stand on? On the back of a second, still larger turtle, was the confident answer. But what holds up the second turtle? The lecturer persisted, now in a slightly exasperated tone. It's of no use, mister, the old lady replied. It's just turtles all the way down. Then, says Hoyle, which epitomizes the conundrum of life. So long as living cells come from pre existing cells, we're calling on support from another turtle. The issue is, where do the turtles stop? And they can't stop because it now we've got a beginning to the universe. It's not an eternal universe, which Hoyle had argued for so long, in part because the beginning of the universe didn't seem to go along with his atheism. And he said that was in part why he kept arguing for the eternal universe.
absolutely. Well,
He's a fun writer. He must have been a character to be around.
thank you so much for reading that because to me, I heard several different anecdotes that I've heard many times before, and they were always attributed to others. Like, for example, the turtles all the way down. I heard Stephen Hawking gave that same anecdote in a lecture one time, but he didn't give credit to Hoyle for coming up with it
I
or
don't know if he birthed the idea of the turtles or not. It may be that the lady in his story was referring to a more ancient version of it. I'm not sure. But Hoyle's just a great writer. He's fun, but oh my goodness, he is brilliant.
absolutely. And it reminds me of the very first God Conclusion podcast that was ever recorded. And it was actually not supposed to be the God Conclusion podcast. It was a conversation I had with this guy named Aaron Ra, or calls himself Aaron Ra.
Okay.
And he's a not only a very outspoken atheist, he's a Satanist. And
Hmm.
he likes to make these educational videos promoting evolution and that this sort of thing and that. And we had a like a 2 hour battle of wills, for lack of a better way to describe it. But at one point, I quoted the whole quote from my book where I talked about the super intellect, and his response was Fred Hoyle was a moron. And, and I said, and I'm sorry I said this, but I couldn't stop myself from saying, my friend, you are not worthy of carrying Fred Hoyle's jockstrap.
Good assessment. Yeah,
I mean, this guy has
I
a
have an atheist friend I was talking to, and he was talking about this thing. He said, "Oh, I don't believe anything Fred Hoyle says." I'm like, why? Apparently, because he comes to a different conclusion than you like. It's not because of his lack of evidence. It's not like my friend had done these, mathematical assessments of cells and whatever. But yeah, if people don't want to believe, they're always. One of my students said one time when I was given astronomical odds, I believe it was on this very subject. He said he was an atheist. And he said, at least there's some chance that it happened naturalistically. And if there's some chance, okay, even if it's 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power against it, okay, that doesn't mean impossible. And so to him, that was enough warrant to say, okay, there was probably a naturalistic explanation. Because maybe the idea of a God to him is just so repugnant or so outlandish that you can't consider that intelligence in the end. Can I just we just have a few more minutes. Can I just tell some of the I think a lot of people are not familiar with a lot of the different ways that people argue for God. Can I just read
absolutely.
off a
Please
few of
do.
these? Near death experiences. I talk about those. Deathbed experiences. We've talked about those before, but those are people who study these and have studied them for a lifetime would say, ooh, this encountering a being of light who's personal, who's very smart, who loves us very much. It just sounds a lot like God. And so people who have these experiences tend to believe in God. Deathbed experiences, contemporary miracles and answer to prayer. Now, some of my students rate all three of these, and even the fourth one, special knowledge through spiritual encounters, when they rate, I'd say more of my students rate these as 10 out of 10s than any of the other arguments. And often they'll say, here's why I take that argument to be so powerful. It's not because of the way you argued it. Sometimes it's because of that, the evidence that I gave, but they'll say, I had one of those experiences in my own life. Or let me tell you what happened to my grandmom when she was dying. And or look what my mom told me about this. A trusted relative happened, but often it actually happened to them. Just some outlandish answer to prayer that seems very hard to attribute to naturalism. So then there are beginning of the universe type arguments. Exhibit 5 I've got is the beginning of the universe. The exhibit 6, six super precise numbers that fine tune our universe for life. And I think scientists have come up with a lot more than six now, but that's the first ones I read. Exhibit 7, the order and laws of the universe. Isaac Newton particularly thought this was a very powerful argument. Where did these laws come from, except from a lawgiver? The vast complexity of earliest cells, that's what we've been talking about, the complexity of living creatures. Then section 3, I've got existential fit, things about our existence. Exhibit 10 is belief in God seems to fit life as we experience it, making it better. That's something that drew me to God in the first place. I thought It just seems like people who are living for him have a better quality of life that I didn't have at the time. Exhibit 11, many attest to sensing a God shaped vacuum in their heart that could only be filled by God, and just material things, fulfilling lusts, eating a lot of good things just didn't ultimately fulfill. Often a paradigm shift or gestalt experience results in a new view. Such vivid experiences as consciousness and free will don't make sense to a lot of people when you're just looking at it in a naturalistic perspective, such as Susan Blackmore would. 14, such vivid experiences as objective morals are best explained by the existence of God. C.S. Lewis argued that in the moral argument. William Craig argues that as well. The phenomenon of widespread belief is the next section. Many people reported direct apprehension of God. The guy that started Alcoholics Anonymous, he was pretty much atheist, secular guy, came to the end of himself, could not defeat alcohol. He was about to have himself institutionalized. Finally, at the end of his rope, he says, God, if you're there, show yourself. And he had an extremely dramatic vision from God, and he never drank a sip after that. So that's why AA, and he took AA from a Christian organization basically that was doing this type thing. A lot of the steps came from, I believe it's called the Oxford Club in New York. But that's why God is all over AA and recovery programs to this day. Direct apprehension of God. Many people report a compelling firsthand experience with God. That would actually be where the person founding AA would come. Many respected individuals believe in God. Now, just because a bunch of people believe it doesn't mean it's true. But when people say, oh, this evidence for God is just, it's just like believing in a flying spaghetti monster that's just outside the reach of our best telescopes, they're saying there is no evidence. If there's no evidence, why does such a high percentage of extremely intelligent people who have claimed to have studied it out believe it? Objections to theism aren't insurmountable. Positive arguments for naturalism don't prevail. Then I mentioned Pascal's wager at the end. What I want to do is just take 3 pages or so for each argument and say, here's the gist of the argument. If you want to go explore it, here are a few good resources that you could go into and look into it. And this has been very useful with my students. And if you don't want to buy the book, I'll send you a free PDF of it. I'm not out to make money. I'm out to get to the truth of some very important things.
Actually, you've got other books on NDEs and the near death experience and contemporary miracles. So you don't need to elaborate further in this book. You just need to direct them to your other work.
Yes, on those two lines of argument, I've definitely gone. I've taken a decade to study out those first two arguments, and written. I'll eventually have written probably over 1,000 pages on near death and deathbed experiences.
Very good. Now, Pascal's wager, I've never been convinced that's the best argument for God, but what is the reason that you included it in
I
the
think
book?
I put it at the end because a lot of people will say, I'm just agnostic. I'm 50-50 on this thing. But yeah, I see some evidence for God, but then there's the problem of evil. And if God's so good, why? And I don't know. I just have evidence back and forth. How do you make a decision at the end on something that some people may feel like they're 50-50 on? Now, I think what Pascal did is said it's like this. If you make a decision for God and you end up being wrong, you probably haven't really lost much because it's a good way to live anyway. It'll save you from a lot of trouble. If you're following God, you probably won't get strung out on meth or something because you're trying to take care of your body. You're trying to do the biblical thing. And so if you vote for God and live for Him, then you've not lost out on a lot, according to Pascal. But if you vote against God and belief in God and Jesus was a part of salvation, and you were wrong there, oh my goodness, because of the consequences on the other side, if you're 50-50 on it, why not lean over toward God and live as if He exists? Now, to me, this would be very similar to today. I have a brother who worked for Chevron all his life, and a part of what he would do is risk management. If you're going to build, he was building um, an oil refinery in Russia, and you've got to sit down and assess, is it worth it? Okay, what if we build this whole thing and then Russia closes off their borders and says, oh, by the way, that refinery is now ours? Or what if there's some storm that's going to come in and pollute the water around this? So you've got to say, what's the risk of reward and what's the risk, that the danger of losing millions and millions of dollars? And that's the way we make decisions. So let's say you're living in New Orleans and somebody says there's a 50% chance that the worst hurricane ever is coming through. 50-50. You don't just sit there agnostic. You've got to decide, either do I stay or do I get out of town? And I would say in that case, the risk on the downside is so great. If this is really a hurricane that actually hits right here and it's going to be devastating and I die, the risk is so great, even if it's just 50-50 odds, I'm going to act as if the hurricane's really coming through. I'm getting out of town. I think that's what Pascal's trying to say with Pascal's wager is, if you're 50-50, wager on God. Even if you're 70-30, maybe you ought to wager on God, because there's just so much at stake.
I
So
agree with that.
it's not an argument for God in the sense of his existence. It's more of an argument of saying, where should I go with my life in the light of the evidence if I don't find the whole thing totally compelling?
I think we would both acknowledge that Blaise Pascal was a brilliant scientist in his time, but in his time gave him a disadvantage, a noticeable disadvantage, because of all of the discoveries that happened in the 20th century. We discovered the evidence for the Big Bang. We discovered DNA. There was so much learned in the last 125 years compared to the 500 or so years before that, or more. And Pascal was, like I said, at a disadvantage to where you could say the universe was a 50-50 proposition, that God created it or God didn't create it. But my argument now is, with the planned versus unplanned universe and the calculations that we have from these other scientists, the odds are not 50-50. The odds
No.
are 99.99999, go on out as far as you want, versus the 0.0001% probability that it did happen by unplanned processes.
So I
It,
think his argument would apply even more to my student who's saying, okay, so it's one out of trillions odds that this could happen naturalistically, but still, hey, maybe one day science will come up with some reason. And I'm saying all we got to deal with is the evidence of today. And if it's one in trillions chance, you don't want to risk those kind of odds. And so I think Pascal's wager would apply all the more to those people that are hoping the odds somehow work out with naturalism. He'd say, why take the chance? It's just not a chance worth taking. Even if it were 50-50, even maybe, and he doesn't say the 50-50 thing, that's just me surmising. He might say, if there's an 80% chance that there's not a God, and there's only a 20% chance of a God, think that you're in New Orleans and there's a 20% chance that a totally devastating hurricane is coming through. I think you're still going to leave town.
oh, absolutely.
And so I think it's a pretty powerful argument when seen from a decision making standpoint.
Now, if it's a 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power chance, I'm thinking that I might stay. But 20% probability is too high for me.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I see that we're almost at 1 o'clock, and I know you have a 1 o'clock appointment. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you for your time today. And I look forward in anticipation to our next conversation, which will be about Richard Dawkins and his God delusion. which is the other book that you wrote that I wanted to speak with you about.
Forward to talking about that. And we think along so many same lines and find so many of the same arguments to be compelling that really makes for a fun discussion. So I appreciate you having me. I'll look forward to our next time.
Thank you again. On a parting note, I wanted to say one more thing about Fred Hoyle, and that
Okay.
was what to me made him arguably the most brilliant scientist of the last century was he is credited with coming up with an experiment to test the anthropic principle. And Fowler and I can't say his last name, the Indian fellow that worked with Willie Fowler, they both won the Nobel Prize in physics for conducting Hoyle's experiment. But Hoyle was too famously irritable with and prickly with the other scientists that they disrespected him.
Wow.
But
I was just I wasn't trying to distract. That's the person you're trying to pronounce, who I can't pronounce either. So I'm just leaving it up to the audience to pronounce it however they wish.
Thank you again, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right, have a
And
great day.
thanks to our audience, whoever's watching. Appreciate you guys. These are important issues. We have fun with them, but we're trying to get back to the truth of these issues and where does the evidence lie, which has made a big impact on both of our lives in a very positive way.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.